I never imagined I would feel such excitement. It had been years since I had last seen my brother Tim. Life had taken us on different routes, me to the hustle and bustle of the big city, where I was building a career, and him to the quiet corner where he had settled down with his family. Memories of our childhood always warmed my soul, ringing laughter, common pranks and those moments when he easily lit up the atmosphere with his sincere humor. It all seemed distant, almost forgotten. But one day, going through old boxes in the attic, I found an old photo of us. We were pictured at a summer picnic, carefree and smiling happily. Looking at the photo, I felt something long forgotten inside, as if a wave of nostalgia had hit me unexpectedly. On impulse, I texted him, "Hi Tim. It's been a long time. How are you doing over there? Is everything okay?" To my surprise, it didn't take long for a reply. Our communication resumed so easily and casually, as if we had never stopped being close. We exchanged stories from the past, recalled family jokes and funny situations, discussed our strange relatives, whom we always laughed at in secret. I felt a warmth in my soul, the very same warmth that had disappeared years ago, as if a quiet joy had come back into my life. Time flew, and when we agreed to meet up, I realized how much I missed those conversations. A few days later, Tim suggested we meet because he was going to visit a friend in my city. I hesitated a little. My husband Robert had gone to his parents' ranch for a few days, and the thought of meeting Tim suddenly seemed too tempting. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing wrong with it. He was my brother, after all, and we just wanted to see each other after a long separation. The day of the meeting came, and I stood in front of the mirror, carefully selecting an outfit. I wanted to look both casual and impeccable, as if it were a meeting with someone much more important than just a relative. At the cafe where we'd agreed to go, my heart beat faster. When I walked in, Tim was waiting at a corner table, his face lit up with a smile and the familiar mischievous sparkle in his eyes. He seemed a little older, with a slight gray on his temples, but his charm remained the same. "My dear sister, you look marvelous," he exclaimed, rising to greet me. His hug was tight and his voice sounded like he was genuinely happy to see me. We talked for a while, diving into memories and catching up on the years we'd missed. Tim talked passionately about his work and family, and I shared fragments of my life in the city, and our conversation flowed like a smooth river through the years and distances. Every hour we pressed closer and closer to each other, laughter filled the air like a long-forgotten melody, and I felt comfortable around him in a way I hadn't in a long time. Behind the smiles and jokes, though, there was an unspoken tension, like a thin line that we were carefully skirting but that was getting harder and harder not to cross. I could feel it in his gaze, in the way he sometimes touched my arm, and in the way he fell silent when I spoke. Time flew by, and by the time we got up to leave, it was getting dark outside the window. Tim looked at me with such intensity that it took my breath away. His eyes seemed to be searching for answers to questions he didn't dare ask. "Jane, it was so nice to see you again. We should do this more often," he said, a quiet plea in his voice. I smiled back, but inside I felt that this meeting had left a mark that had changed something in me. My life was colorful again, but there were new questions I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't understand it, but something had changed between us, a connection that didn't feel like sibling love. Something I thought I'd buried in the back of my mind had awakened. From the moment I'd seen Tim again, thoughts of him had come back to me with redoubled force, though I'd tried to push them away. I remembered his laughter, his gaze, the spark that flared between us, and how its glow lingered long after our conversation ended. It was as if we remained on the same wavelength, connected by invisible threads, despite the long years of separation. When Robert, my husband, returned from his trip, I felt a kind of detachment. I was happy to see him, but our conversations were reduced to familiar topics, discussing work, household chores, and weekend plans. A familiar routine, lacking the vibrancy that had suddenly flared up during my meetings with Tim. I loved my husband, but I realized that over time the spark that had warmed our relationship had weakened considerably. This seemed especially evident now in contrast to the energy that filled me in Tim's presence. One night, when Robert went out to a bar with some friends, I gave in to the urge to contact my brother again. Nothing wrong with that, I just want to keep in touch, catch up, I told myself. I picked up my phone and sent him a text. A reply followed almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for us to talk again. "Why don't we get together this weekend? Tim suggested, and my chest filled with anticipation. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in years. It was the excitement of something inappropriate, and the closer the weekend got, the more excited I became. I didn't know if I should go to this meeting, but something was inexorably pulling me forward. When the day of our meeting came, I prepared thoroughly. I wanted to look in a way that made my appearance seem casually appealing, effortless yet charming. I entered the cafe with a slight shiver in my hands. Tim was already sitting at a table, his face lit up when he saw me. "You look wonderful, as always," he said, standing up to give me a hug. There was genuine joy in his voice, and I felt a glimmer of it touch me. We sat down, ordered coffee, and our conversation flowed as it had long ago, easy and relaxed. But this time the topics went deeper than before. We began to share our dreams and fears with each other. Before I knew it, the conversation had moved from a simple exchange of news to a frank discussion of what was hidden deeper, behind the masks of ordinary smiles. Tim listened intently, never taking his eyes off my face. His eyes looked straight into my soul, as if he wanted to see more than I was willing to show. We sat so close that our knees touched, and every time he casually touched my arm or shoulder, I felt a spark run through my body. It was a sensation I couldn't suppress or ignore. I convinced myself that it was just friendship, that we were just reconnecting after a long time apart. But it was getting harder by the minute. "Do you ever feel like life is just passing us by?" Tim asked, his voice low and thoughtful. "Like we could be someone else, living a different life, if we made different choices." His words struck a chord with me. I realized I felt the same way. "Every day," I whispered, "I feel like I'm stuck in a rut. Everything is so routine, and I lose sight of what's really important." Tim nodded, his gaze remaining intense. I saw something in his eyes that made my heart suddenly beat harder. It wasn't just support, not just understanding, but something more, maybe the forbidden spark that was now becoming unbearably obvious. We left the cafe and decided to walk around the city. The cold evening air was refreshing and a little sobering. We walked side by side, and the silence between us was no longer awkward, but intense. I could feel myself approaching the line beyond which our meeting would cease to be innocent. But it was the unknown that beckoned me. Every step I took with Tim brought me closer to the forbidden. When he suddenly took my hand, I didn't recoil. The gesture was so natural, as if we were meant to be there all along. Tim stood so close that I could feel the warmth of his body, like a flame had slipped between us, making the air vibrate. His eyes, deep and serious, searched mine, and his words, spoken in a low voice, penetrated my heart, rekindling long-forgotten feelings. His confession seemed to unmask our friendship, revealing to me a truth I'd tried to ignore. The line between just friends and something more began to blur, and with every word Tim said, I realized more and more clearly that I was standing on the edge of a precipice. I felt panic rising inside. What am I doing? Why had I let this go this far? Our hands were still joined, and his fingers were gently squeezing mine. I tried to find the strength to pull away, to take a step back, but it was as if my body refused to listen. Instead, I just whispered back, "Tim, we don't have to, you understand, don't you?" "I know," he interrupted, looking straight into my eyes. "But we can't deny what's happening. You feel it too, don't you?" It was hard to lie when the truth was pounding inside, trying to break free. The feelings I'd buried so long ago resurfaced, like shadows of the past that couldn't be ignored. Yes, I felt it, the magnetic pull, the undeniable spark that flew between us every time we met, every time his laughter echoed in my mind. These encounters became bright moments in my life, which seemed to lack color. But there was another side to it, my family. My husband, who increasingly noticed that I had become aloof and distracted, as if a shadow had crept into our home. He would look at me with long, questioning stares, and I would just hide behind routines and excuses, hoping it would all go away. But the farther I allowed myself to go with Tim, the more I realized the chasm between my husband and me. That Sunday, when I saw Tim at my car outside my house, I thought my heart was ready to jump out of my chest with fear. Had he really come straight here? What if my husband saw us? But Tim, as if he didn't notice my anxiety, simply walked closer, his hand found mine again, and we walked together. The lightness and joy of our conversations contrasted so strongly with the tension that hung over my daily life. It was like this was another reality, a world where we could be real. When we stopped at the edge of the park, I realized I didn't want to let this moment go. There was something more than attraction in his eyes, it was a call I couldn't ignore anymore. He stepped closer, almost touching my lips with his breath. My heart thundered in my chest, and I didn't know if I could keep myself from stepping into the unknown. "I didn't mean to push you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But I can't pretend I don't care anymore. You mean so much more to me than just an old acquaintance." I pulled back, my inner voice desperately trying to keep me from doing something rash. I should stop, I should go back to my family, back to my normal life. But the way Tim was looking at me made me forget everything. His words tore my heart apart, and I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. Maybe I really had let myself go too far. Or maybe this was the one moment when life required the courage to take a risk for something real? I squeezed Tim's hand tighter, and he noticed. His fingers wrapped around mine with such warmth that I felt something change inside. It wasn't just a moment, it was a point of no return, when there was no turning back. Through the shroud of dark thoughts, I could feel my heart beating at a different rhythm than I was used to. This time it wasn't fear or excitement, but something deeper, a mixture of guilt and elation. The feelings I couldn't ignore were driving me crazy. I love my husband, and at the same time I can't get rid of the thought of Tim, my brother. How is that possible? As I was torn between two worlds, between affection for the man I spent my best years with and the intrigue coming from Tim, each day seemed darker and more confusing. I realized that this whole situation was going to turn out to be painful for everyone. The thought of hurting someone had always put me on edge, but something about this connection with Tim was incredibly appealing. I knew it could change everything. That night, as my husband and I began to prepare dinner, it looked like life was back to normal. We're laughing, setting the table, and he suddenly starts whispering tender words to me, touching my hair, beginning to kiss my neck tenderly. But I felt those affectionate gestures push me away. All I could think about was Tim's. I couldn't help but think about the fact that this wasn't really the man I desired at this moment at all. My husband pulled away abruptly, and I saw his gaze become full of bewilderment and pain. "What's going on?" he asked, desperation in his voice. I felt myself getting heavy, as if there was a huge rock stuck in my chest. I tried to smile, to squeeze out a calm answer, but his suspiciousness left no chance. "I'm just a little overwhelmed," I mumbled, hoping that would reassure him. But he nodded doubtfully. "You can talk to me about anything, I'm here for you." Fear gripped me. I wanted to tell him how I felt, the confusion that overwhelmed me, but the words stuck in my throat. Over and over I sank into my thoughts and eventually left the evening full of secrets and lies. As I lay in bed, I realized that my inner state was becoming more and more unbearable. Each encounter with Tim only added to this tension. The chemistry between us was heating up, and with it came guilt. I was living a double life, and the feeling was unbearable. I couldn't understand what was happening to me until I decided to confront Tim that night. I knew I had to open up to him, even though excitement encompassed me. When I walked into the bar, he was already there. His face was serious, and for a moment I wondered if we had enough energy for this meeting. We sat down, and the air around us was saturated with tension. I tried to relax and offered us each a glass of whiskey to ease the fear. I kept wondering what was going to happen next, how we were going to talk about what we had in common, but the words felt like they were stuck in my throat. Tim leaned closer and his eyes searched mine, full of questions and uncertainty. "I don't want to put you in a predicament," he said, but his voice sounded like he'd already made a move he couldn't undo. I knew this moment would be a turning point for both of us. How hard could it be? I didn't know what to think myself. My hand reached for his, and it felt so natural, like we'd always been there for each other. We started talking, and I felt the tension rising, the waves of desire crashing over us, leaving no chance of escape. "I can't hide anymore," I said with difficulty, knowing that this could be the beginning of the end. The moment the words left my lips, I realized I had chosen my path, a path full of uncertainty and risk, but with unexpected hope for a future that could only be ours.